According to the reliable source, the sitting U.S. President Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, will travel to Abu Dhabi for negotiation with Ukraine and Russia this week. Again, according to the Post, that the news come as Ukraine and Russia prepare for another round of talk this week, aimed at ending Russia's full-scale invasion, which is soon to hit the 4th anniversary. It's rather devastating, again, as the beginning of 2026, we continue to talk about the war in Ukraine. And of course, if you follow our show closely, this is not an easy case. And Donald Trump has been very bold and loud regarding the result, and especially boasting about his relationship between Russia and also U.S. at this moment. But when it comes to international order, how do we make of that? It's not something that new to us that we know today is getting more and more complicated. But meanwhile, we need to remain patient and also calm when it comes to international chaos. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is an American historian and political scientist. He's a writer, and also he's a resident of New York City. He is a professor of political science at Rutgers University in New York, and a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thanks for having me, Will, and thank you for your audience for listening or watching.
Absolutely, sir. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Now, I do want to get started with one of the social media posts from sitting U.S. President Donald Trump, not about the war in Ukraine, but also about something more crucial, the relationship with China. This is what he wrote on social media, and I quote, "I have just completed an excellent telephone conversation with President Xi of China. It was a long and thorough call where many important subjects were discussed, including trade, military, and the April trip that I'll be making to China. The relationship with China and my personal relationship with President Xi, it's an extremely good one, and we both realize how important it is to keep it that way," end quote. Dr. Motyl, let's talk about the rhetoric and the words that Donald Trump used on social media. What do you make of that? I mean, again, on one hand, and we know that when we look at the war in Ukraine, previously that Donald Trump mentioned that China was very much interested in helping or supporting the role that U.S. play. But on the other hand, we see this up and down relationship with China. But now that we just heard the message on social media about Xi and Trump and also China and U.S. putting everything together, how credible are the words and what do we believe? Your thoughts?
Well, for starters, one has to take just about everything that Donald Trump says with a grain of salt. We don't know whether he's serious or not, whether he's under the impression of immediate events or not, whether he's just being unpredictable or not, whether he's lying or not, whether he misunderstood or not. So given all those factors, and they've been, they relate to just about everything he's been saying for the last year, one has to read this particular text with a somewhat skeptical eye. On the other hand, it's perfectly possible that what he said was meant quite seriously and that it effectively reflects the reality. We just don't happen to know. I understand that one of the key topics was Taiwan, which Trump strategically doesn't mention. And I can't imagine that it was resolved in any way in their conversation. Quite the opposite. It seems to be the case that she insists on Taiwan's eventual, if not immediate, annexation to the Chinese mainland. So it's quite possible that Trump, being the kind of glory-seeking individual that he is, put a very positive gloss on the conversation that might have been a bit more contentious. But we just don't know. Now, that all said, it's obviously good that the Americans and the Chinese are talking. This may lead to some kind of rapprochement. We don't know, but it's conceivable. It's certainly better that they're talking than if they were fighting. So it's conceivable that this may lead to something. Unfortunately, with Trump, I mean, he goes one step forward, two steps backward, two steps forward, one step backward. It's very difficult to predict what he believes and what he wants and what he eventually hopes to achieve. But as I said, it's better that they're talking, and it's good that he'll visit China. What may be important here is the conciliatory tone that he's adopted. Because in the past, he's been very critical of the Chinese. And as you know, he slapped high tariffs and eventually rescinded some of them. There's been semi-hostile talk regarding Chinese economic interests in the United States and other parts of the world. And the conciliatory tone may be reflective, but I emphasize may be reflective of the fact that Trump realizes that he may have gone a bit too far in his criticism of China and that he wants to repair relations. But as I said at the beginning, we just don't know. That may be the case or it may not be the case. But that said, it's good that they're talking.
Well, go ahead.
No. I'm finished.
Okay. Well, again, Dr. Motyl, you're right. At this moment, we don't know whether Donald Trump is serious about the relationship with China. Again, given the fact that, to borrow what you just said, it's better that two countries are talking instead of fighting. Now, let's bring another character into our conversation. Again, the war in Ukraine, it's crucial, not only for China, particularly for the US. As we know, the 2026, it's very important and critical for Donald Trump, and everyone is gearing up for the midterm election. And surely Trump or MAGA base, it's very anxious about the results. Again, let's talk about the war in Ukraine. Lately, the Russian foreign minister made a strong statement regarding the reaction from the U.S. and also this conversation with current Secretary of State Marco Rubio. This is what he said during the press conference, and I quote, "The national interest of countries like the U.S. and Russia won't always match up. Most of the time, they won't. But when they do overlap, it will be a mistake, a serious mistake, not to use that moment to agree on practical and mutual beneficial projects in the economy, trade, investment, and so on," end quote. So, Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, let's break it down, the statement. What is the foreign minister actually saying at this moment? So it seemed to us, I mean, again, as an outsider or as a journalist, when we listen to rhetoric or when we listen to the words that came out of the Russian prime minister, it says the national interests of both countries won't always match up. Is there a signal or is that a message directly to Donald Trump to say, hey, I know we're working together, but you can't really twist our arms to do the things that you want us to do? And also that could be another indication or indirect communication to President Zelensky. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. For starters, this has been the Russian line from the very beginning. On the one hand, they say, let's cooperate, let's pursue mutual interests and so on. On the other hand, they bomb Chechnya, they attack Georgia, they invade Ukraine. So their understanding of their own national interests are oftentimes, well, usually, in direct contrast to what the countries like the United States or more generally Western-oriented countries, whether in the global South or in the North, believe to be their interests. So the rhetoric is interesting, but it's not anything new. And it is interesting that he said more often than not, these interests will not coincide, which we know. None of this is terribly new. But when they do, then we should pursue them again, which is obviously the case. I mean, there's nothing new in any of that, and no revelations on Lavrov's part. Quite the opposite. It's just a restatement of the Russian position. Now, what he also may have had in mind is the fact that Donald Trump hasn't renewed the nuclear weapons controls treaty. That seems to be a case of something that is of mutual interest to both sides. And Lavrov may have been intending to hint that it would be a good thing if the United States did not abjure the treaty, but maintained it, remained true to its spirit and to its letters. So it's conceivable he may have had that in mind. But basically, the thing to remember whenever a Russian official speaks is to look at the contrast between the rhetoric and the actual behavior. And the rhetoric is often, if not indeed always, conciliatory, talks of peace, talks of mutual interest. And then you look at the actual behavior, and it's the exact opposite.
Dr. Motyl, let's talk about another critical concept. It's what we called the middle power. Now, let's take a step back and trace back to a couple weeks ago, the meeting or the World Economic Forum in Davos. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made a strong statement, especially towards the West. When we look at the international order, and also, again, before we tape the show, that we were still quite puzzled about Donald Trump's desire in Greenland. But this is what the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, this is what he said during the meeting, and I want to share this with you because it's quite stunning to see the way he put the language. And this is what he said, and I quote, that this is especially true for middle power countries that lack the dominance of great power but possess distinctive industrial, resource, or diplomatic capabilities. Carney called for middle power to join forces to counter growing global volatility, but many middle power have already taken a different route, acting alone as niche superpower. So again, Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, when we look at the strategy under Donald Trump, and when we look at this ongoing competition between US and China, do you think that today is it time for the middle power to be united or perhaps to take alone steps in order to counter or in order to prepare the unprecedented, what we say, surprises or unprecedented events? What do you think of that?
I think Carney is right. I mean, it's time for the middle powers to organize. Well, as a matter of fact, they already have organized. I mean, the middle powers that he's most concerned with as a Canadian would, of course, be the Europeans. And the Europeans are already organized within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, within the European Union. So in that sense, he's really talking about not so much the creation of a middle power coalition, but of a kind of galvanization and activization. Because despite the fact that the Europeans are united in these two institutions, the structure of the institutions is such that it makes it very difficult for them to agree on anything, and certainly on anything decisive, such as what Carney presumably has in mind when he talks about defending against the hegemony of the big powers. So on the one hand, the goal is admirable. If middle powers could agree, let's say there are 20, 30, or 40 middle powers could agree on a common platform, on a common defense, on a common economic interaction and the like, that would certainly be to their benefit, and it could certainly balance the hegemony, as Carney put it, of the United States or China. The problem with that kind of solution is that there is always going to be a temptation for bits and pieces of these middle power coalitions to break away and to align with either China, the US, or possibly Russia. We see that in the European Union with the case of Hungary and Slovakia. In principle, they should realize that their interests really do align with those of France, Germany, Austria, Poland, and so on, if only because of the geography. But instead, both prime ministers, both the two leaders of both countries, actually align with Russia and with Mr. Putin. And in that sense, in as much as they have veto power in NATO and the European Union, they can prevent both the institutions from adopting decisive steps. So that's a problem that the middle powers need to address. Either they form a smaller union without the interference of these interfering countries, or else they're going to remain essentially a kind of a hopeful paper construction. And I think Carney and the Europeans understand that they need to move ahead. They need to do something so as to transform this coalition of the willing into something more institutionalized. But that, of course, means spending more on defense. It means developing a security policy that happens to reflect the interests of all the countries concerned. That's not easy. It can be done, but it's not easy. Certainly, it's not easy given the structure of the institutions at present. If you think about it, it's outrageous that two tiny countries like Hungary and Slovakia, which have absolutely almost no weight geopolitically, are able to prevent the European Union and NATO from acting decisively. That's, again, it's part of the way the institutions are structured, but it's a crazy system, one that essentially dooms both institutions to failure unless they can somehow resolve this particular problem.
Well, Dr. Motyl, again, stay with me. I have two more questions before letting you go. Again, I agree with you 100%. Like today, when we look at the middle powers are uniting among themselves in order to prepare the unprecedented or uncertain future. But in reality, both Canadian Prime Minister and also the British Prime Minister paid a short visit to China prior to attending the World Economic Forum in Davos. Because what happened in the West and also this rocky relationship between US and Canada, again, Trump's desire in Greenland. But on social media, Donald Trump warned the Canadian Prime Minister that to say, I may paraphrase this, being close to China is acceptable. But if you're being too close, or if you're playing a dangerous game with China to be against the US, that is not okay, or that's not acceptable for Donald Trump. So at this moment, again, those countries, they're looking at this competition between US and China. But meanwhile, they are forced to pick sides in order to remain sane. They're looking for sanity, not insanity. So Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, what do you make of that? It's the British Prime Minister trip to China, a Canadian Prime Minister to China, and also his rhetoric, the strong rhetoric towards Donald Trump and towards Donald Trump's foreign policy. So what does this scenario play out? So in other words, how do we interpret that? Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it makes great sense. Since the United States has adopted a hostile tone and arguably hostile policies towards the Europeans and Canada. After all, Mr. Trump refers to Canada as the 51st state and calls Carney governor and things like that. Given the fact that the United States seems intent on breaking its relations with the Europeans and, well, more generally with the West, it makes perfect sense for these countries to seek closer relations, not necessarily alliances, but closer relations with other powers. Russia, obviously, can't possibly fill that role because it's hostile, aggressive, and imperialistic and is losing a war. So the natural partner becomes the opponent, the key opponent of the United States, which is China. At this point, and I think for the foreseeable future, and indeed for the future in general, the Europeans and Canadians are interested in strengthening their economic relations with China. I don't think any of them has the desire to join China in some kind of military alliance directed against the United States or more generally against the world. That's not going to happen. I don't think China wants that. I don't think and I'm sure the Europeans and the Canadians don't want that. So in that sense, Trump's threats are somewhat hollow because he's telling the Europeans not to do what they don't want to do anyway. In contrast, the economic relations will strengthen. And again, for better or for worse, that's essentially the fault or the responsibility of Mr. Trump. If he hadn't adopted such a hostile tone vis-a-vis the Canadians, vis-a-vis Greenland and Denmark, and more generally vis-a-vis the Europeans, then there'd be no reason for the Europeans to seek some kind of closer relations with America's adversary, China. So he could fix this very easily if he simply resumed talking in a sane manner. Unfortunately, the one thing we know about Trump is that he doesn't favor that kind of language. He's always insulting people. He's always making extreme demands. He's always speaking out of both sides of his mouth. That's called unpredictability, but it also is frankly insulting to people. And I think the Europeans are insulted. I'm sure that a large number of Africans, Latin Americans, and Asians are also insulted. And that's simply no way to build relationships with these countries.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, I want to wrap up our conversation by bringing another character into our conversation. Jordan Bardella, the leader of France's far-right party at the national rally, and recently that he came out and strongly criticized, again, the role of Donald Trump and also the desire to interrupt the global order. And again, I want to read a statement that came out of Bardella, and that will be my final question. This is what he quote. When a U.S. president threatens a European territory while using trade pressure, it's not dialogue, it is coercion. And our credibility is at stake. The European Union cannot remain silent. The agreement negotiated last summer must be suspended. The choice is very simple. Submission or sovereignty. Europe must choose freedom, responsibility, and control of its own destiny, end quote. Again, Dr. Motyl, it exactly echo what you just said about Donald Trump and also about the international order. But Donald Trump is not going anywhere for another 2 years. And also, we don't know what the next step he's going to take towards Greenland and also towards NATO allies and etc. So at this moment, it looks like the countries and the European countries are standing at a crossroads. As what Bardella said, Europe must choose freedom, responsibility, and control of its own destiny. So from your perspective, again, looking at the war in Ukraine, how much room can the European countries negotiate with Donald Trump at this moment? And is it really time for the European countries to make critical choices of freedom, responsibility, and also take control of their own destiny? Your final thoughts.
It's high time for them to do that. The Trump administration has demonstrated again and again and again that it is at the very least indifferent to Europe, and at the most it's hostile to the European project. Trump and his people despise the Europeans. They think of them as weak. They think of them as ineffective, as impotent. And they have no interest in working together with them. They've demonstrated that time and again. So the Europeans really do have to face this particular choice. Namely, either they're going to be subordinate to Trump's whims, which means essentially losing sovereignty because those winds can change on a daily basis. Or else they should develop some kind of backbone, reform their structures, their institutions, and develop a common policy that would lead to the continued freedom and sovereignty of the European project. It's significant that Bardella is on board because he's, of course, his party was always a critic of the European Union, as have other right-wing parties in Europe. But now they're switching sides for the very simple reason that they realize that Europe's existence is potentially at risk. They need Europe in order to be against Europe, to put it somewhat ironically. And if Europe simply disappears, then their states, the component states of the European Union and NATO will simply be dominated almost completely by the United States, possibly by Russia, possibly by China. So Europe needs to get its act together. The question is, can it do so quickly? Will it do so quickly? But I think there's general agreement on the part of analysts and policymakers that it has to do so. It's one of these do or die moments in history. And if they fail to make this very critical step, then effectively Europe ceases to exist.
Again, Dr. Motyl, these are great points. Again, at this moment, we are living in the moments that we don't know what's going to happen. Especially regarding the war in Ukraine, and also we're looking at the complication of the international order. But we do know that at the end of the day, we need to remain calm and also remain patient and hopeful. And regardless how the social media messages are going to manipulate our minds, or the messages are trying to confuse us, but again, we don't need insanity, because this is going to be very, very hurtful to the community. Again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Dr. Alexander Motyl. Again, Dr. Motyl is a political scientist, and he's a historian. He's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. And I strongly encourage everyone go online to connect with Dr. Motyl. Again, Dr. Motyl, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I would love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the international affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.